Early morning. The first rays of sunlight had yet to pierce the thin layer of clouds over Logan International Airport when the echo of hurried footsteps rang through the empty corridor. Amid the gray sheen of glass walls and cold fluorescent lights, Veronica Miles stood out like a charcoal stroke carefully drawn across a blank sheet. Her charcoal Armani suit fit like it was tailored by intuition, her Italian leather shoes spotless, and a diamond watch gleamed under the light. Nothing about this woman was accidental. Veronica entered the priority check-in area with a calm that made heads subtly turn. People may not have known her name, but her presence made them step aside. The agent behind the counter gave a slight, respectful bow. "Good morning, Ms. Miles. You're on the 6:45 to New York today, correct?" Veronica gave a brief nod, her eyes never leaving the computer screen. She had taken this flight dozens of times. Always in seat 1, a first class window, silence, not for comfort, but as a quiet reminder. She had surpassed every room she was once denied entry to. But today, as the agent typed a few commands and his brow subtly furrowed, the air shifted. "It appears there's been an error. The system shows you in seat 1 for economy plus." Veronica looked up. Just one glance, and not angry, not sharp but colder than the air conditioning hissing from above. "I booked first class, confirmed 3 days ago." "Check again." The agent fumbled, typing again. "We had a plane swap overnight due to a technical issue. The system may have auto-reshuffled seats." "I'll try to fix it." She said nothing, not a sigh. She simply stood there, still, like a shadow of stillness amid the rush. But behind her eyes, old echoes stirred. The years of traveling for work, being booted from business class despite timely bookings, because higher-tier passengers took precedence. The times she had to keep quiet because bringing up race isn't professional. Every part of her remembered that familiar feeling, being looked through, as if her presence was a glitch, not the system's failure. The agent looked up, pale. "I'm very sorry, Ms. Miles. First class is fully booked today, but I'll get you the best available seat in economy plus and flag the system for next time." Veronica didn't respond. She took the ticket, turned, and walked. The weight of her silence followed her through the check-in area, not because she was angry, but because her quietness made everything around her feel cramped, breathless. Women like her didn't need to shout. They just had to look, and people would feel something had gone deeply wrong. She headed straight to the lounge, grabbed a black espresso, no sugar, and sat by the window. Outside, the morning light slowly gilded the aircraft's skin. Beams filtered through the glass, reflecting off her sunglasses, concealing whatever her eyes held. Inside, she recalled a dream from the night before, and just whispers about an empty seat and a man in a hat sitting still, not looking at her. 30 minutes later, Veronica walked to gate K11. The priority boarding lane already had a line. She stood at the end, not out of obedience, but observation. The boarding agent, a blonde woman named Heather Morgan, greeted first-class passengers with bright smiles. But as Veronica handed over her ticket, the smile faltered, just a flicker at the corner of her mouth. "You're in 14D. Please board after Group 1, Heather said with an even tone, but couldn't mask her unease. When Veronica stepped through the jet bridge, light from the windows traced a soft outline along her coat. She turned leftward first class without hesitation. But in seat 1, our usual spot, a white man around 60, salt and pepper hair, Yankees cap, was already seated, legs crossed, flipping through a golf magazine. His bag sprawled across both seats. "Excuse me, that's my seat," Veronica said, her tone light, almost a factual notice. The man didn't look up. "This is my seat. I boarded first. You should double-check." She held out her ticket. 1A. He glanced, scoffed. "I'm a Skyvista million-miler. I always sit here. I'm not moving just because someone got mistakenly upgraded." Veronica didn't argue. She turned to Heather, who had just entered the cabin. "There's a seat issue. This man is occupying 1A. Heather approached, examined both tickets, then frowned. "Looks like there's a seat duplication. One of these was a gate upgrade. I'll need to check." She walked off. The cabin hushed. Other passengers glanced around. No one laughed. No one breathed loud. Pale cabin lights cast a soft glow over Veronica's composed face like she wasn't in a dispute, but preparing to chair a board meeting. Heather returned. "I truly apologize, but it seems the system have 1A reserved for Mr. Desmond all along. Your upgrade was due to a system glitch. I'll have to ask you to return to your original seat in Economy Plus." No one breathed. Veronica stood still, ticket clearly marked 1A in hand. All eyes fell on her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't tighten her jaw. She simply asked, a breeze laced with frost, "Do you know who I am?" It wasn't arrogance, not a flex of power. It was a sincere question, heavy with layers. "Do you truly understand what just happened here?" Heather froze. In that instant, she wasn't a flight attendant but someone teetering between ignorance and negligence. Veronica didn't wait for a reply. She nodded, softly said, "I'll return to economy. But before takeoff, I want the names of today's lead flight attendant and the captain." Heather complied. Veronica wrote them down, then turned. She walked past awkward glances, embarrassed silence, and stiff indifference. Every step she took struck the cabin floor with an unspoken message. Something is very wrong here, and this woman will not let it go. Seat 1 for D welcomed her with the indifference of economy. But that was fine, because in just a few hours, the woman denied her seat today would be seated in a position far higher than 1A. She hadn't lost a first-class seat. She'd just laid the first brick of reform. Boston for 57 a.m. The penthouse on the 42nd floor of the glass-lined tower was still cloaked in darkness, lit only by the glow of a kitchen clock outlining quiet objects, an Italian coffee press on the marble counter, a vase of dried flowers by the window, and a Mont Blanc pen resting neatly beside a red-stamped document folder. Everything in the apartment lay in orderly silence, like the woman about to rise in it, one who needed no alarms, who was never late. A soft chime from the smart system, not a call, but a whisper, "It's time." Veronica Miles opened her eyes. No wasted motion. Just one deep breath, as if telling herself, "Begin." She sat up, feet touching the cold wooden floor. Beyond the ceiling, 2-floor windows. Boston's sky still bore its graphite hue. The city held no mystery for her anymore. But today was different. Every step she took would lead to a room where the fate of an airline would change hands. What Edward Collins, the night supervisor at Skyvista, didn't know was that today's meeting wouldn't be about numbers, it would be about a lesson. And that lesson had just been written by his early morning actions. Veronica entered the private gym off her bedroom. The Peloton bike was ready. Soft golden light lit the framed photos on the wall. One of her with her father, Mr. Miles Sr., at her Howard University graduation, another, in black and white, of her late mother standing outside a small beauty shop in Savannah, Georgia. Her mother always wore white dresses, taught her daughter about cleanliness, order, and earning respect not through appearance, but character. Veronica pedaled in silencino music, only her breathing. Sweat traced her temple, but her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Be the storm they didn't prepare for. She had been that storm, but today she would be the eye, silent, steady, no haste, yet powerful enough to sweep away all that didn't belong to justice. After 20 minutes, she entered the marble-tiled bathroom. The shower hummed to life with a buttonworm water cascading like a cleansing ritual. In the mirror, her face appeared sharp, 56, glowing brown skin, high forehead, eyes that brooked no compromise, no fatigue of 3 decades in leadership, only depth and a silence tucked in the corners of her eyes, where some truths couldn't be spoken. At 6:50 a.m., she wore the same Armani suit she'd be denied entry in ironically. To the seat it symbolized. At the table, a simple breakfast: round toast, avocado, espresso, prepared by Maria, her loyal housekeeper of 17 years, a petite Puerto Rican woman with quiet, knowing eyes. "No eggs today?" Maria asked gently. Veronica shook her head. eyes scanning her tablet for the meeting agenda. Today's the big one. Right? Maria placed her coffee beside her. Yes. If it goes as planned, by noon SkyVista will be under Arclight Holdings. Maria paused, then softly said, I don't think they know how lucky they are to have you leading. Veronica looked up, her gaze brushing that compliment like it had passed over an old scar. She didn't respond right away, just sipped her coffee, exhaled, and said quietly, not everyone wants to be led, especially not by someone who doesn't look like them. Maria didn't reply. They had lived that truth too long to be surprised. 7 a.m. The car waited downstairs, a polished black Lincoln, driven by Derek, a former soldier. He knew not to play music, nor to make small talk. Veronica valued silence. It was when she thought best, and today, she wasn't thinking about numbers. She was thinking about Heather Morgan's facetted flicker. When she realized who the denied passenger truly was, the stiffened face of the man and won all when he sensed the woman before him could alter the fate of his airline. Veronica wasn't angry. She had moved past anger. What she carried now was observation and calculation, because men like Edward Collins weren't worth losing composure over. But the system that enabled him, that treated her seat downgrade as a routine technical issue, that was the rot worth unearthing layer by layer, root by root. Every sanctioned microaggression clothed in corporate policy. The car turned into Logan's VIP entrance. Veronica stepped out, adjusted her collar, and slid on her sunglasses. The sky shimmered with its first streak of light. She paused at the entrancia ritual, feeling the weight of her step, as the first move in a chain of events none at SkyVista's board could foresee. The airport awoke in its usual rhythm, intercom announcements, suitcase wheels, keystrokes, but they faded from her hearing. The only thing she heard clearly was her own whisper. The last time someone took my seat without consequences was in 1995. That won't happen again. She passed through the automatic doors. The day began. And when a day begins with someone like her, it means something far greater is about to be rewritten. 3:47 a.m., an hour when most of Boston was still half asleep. The streets hummed with the sound of sanitation crews sweeping up the night, and the sky had yet to decide whether it was still night or already dawn. But on the 6th floor of the SkyVista Operations Building, home to the company's 24/7 command center, pale fluorescent lights had been buzzing non-stop for over 8 hours. In that cold, sterile room, Edward Collins sat before 3 computer monitors, clutching a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago. His eyes locked on the list of passengers affected by the aircraft swap. On the 6:45 a.m. flight from Boston to New York, the original Boeing 787 had been pulled due to a minor radar issue in the left wing. Not serious, but regulations required a replacement. The substitute, a smaller Airbus A320, meant cutting 6 first-class seats. It should have been a routine technical adjustment. It should have been. But when the auto-reassignment system displayed Veronica Miles as one of the passengers downgraded, Edward's eyes stopped like a misplaced stroke in a painting he'd memorized by heart. He didn't need to look her up, didn't need a reminder that she, the powerful black female CEO of Arclight Holdings, was the one set to acquire SkyVista at 9 a.m. that morning. Every internal meeting, every memo, revolved around her name, and to Edward, that name was a threat. He once loved aviation the way someone loves an old home, cramped, dusty, but full of memories. He joined SkyVista in 1990 as a baggage handler. Back then, he believed hard work would always be recognized, and it was gradually. Not because he was brilliant, but because he endured. But now, he felt the very thing he had helped build, or at least had spent a lifetime defending, was being dismantled by people like Veronica, outsiders, with perfectly enunciated speech, expensive clothes, and no understanding of what made up the SkyVista's spirit. Edward sat still, staring at the screen. His face reflected faintly in the glass, the rough features of a once valued man, now pushed out of important meetings. No one asked his opinion anymore. No one invited him to strategy sessions. All that remained were these overnight shifts, the final guard posts before he became obsolete. Tonight, he hadn't planned to do anything wrong. But when he saw her name, attached to first-class seat 1A, something deep within him screamed, "Don't let her sit there." His mouse hovered over Override Auto Assignment. One click, and Veronica remained downgraded. A system warning popped up. "Confirm override for high-priority passenger." He didn't read it twice. Another click. Done. Silent. Edward leaned back. The LED lights glimmered across his sweat-slicked forehead. No one had seen. No one questioned him. It all happened in silence. He told himself it wasn't discrimination. Just a nudge, a way to remind her and the world that power can't buy respect. But what Edward didn't know was that the woman he just reminded had spent her youth surviving a lifetime of reminders like that. And this time, she would not stay silent. Elsewhere in the operations center, 2 other night shift employees were busy reviewing maintenance data from Denver. They didn't notice Edward, and he didn't care. All he could see was Veronica, not the real woman, but a symbol. A face of the new power he didn't trust, not because she was black, but because she didn't belong to the world he knew, a world where people like him were the center. 4:35 a.m. Edward left his station, headed toward the coffee machine. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the cup, not from the cold but because he knew, deep down, what he'd done wasn't just a technical move. It was a decision, one that would have consequences. Meanwhile, in the Logan Airport lounge, Veronica was reviewing the final draft of the merger agreement. She didn't yet know her name had been locked in on the downgrade list. But as if some sixth sense stirred, she paused, hand resting on the folder, eyes drifting toward the window. The sun was just beginning to cut through the thin morning clouds, painting a silver streak across the wintry sky. Her gaze didn't move, but her mind had already begun connecting threads. And once her feet touched the cabin floor, the pieces would start falling into place. As Edward returned to his desk, the internal phone lit up an automated alert from the check-in system. Passenger with platinum priority downgraded to 1 for D. Flagged for review due to VIP tag mismatch. His eyes froze. He didn't click acknowledge. He shut off the screen, wiped away the trace. And in that sterile lit room, a man chose to act as if no one would ever know. But what he hadn't calculated was that the woman he just downgraded wasn't just a VIP. She was about to rewrite the entire system he once thought untouchable. 7:58 a.m. Gate K11, Logan International Airport. The sun had fully broken past the cloud veil, spilling hunted light onto the polished tile floor. A sea of passengers clustered in lines, each face stamped with urgency, exhaustion, or blank routine, the usual hues of morning air travel. But apart from the crowd, Veronica Miles stood quietly, as if observing a play she no longer wished to star in. In her hand was a reprinted ticket from the priority counter. 1 for D Economy Plus, bold letters, like a declaration. She was used to minor inconveniences as a CEO. But what made her quiet wasn't the seat. It was how smoothly everything had slipped into place, each gear in the so-called mistake, turning at the exact time, in the exact direction, and always somehow against her. She told herself not to be paranoid. In this business, planes change, seats get reshuffled, agents forget updates. But this time, when she met Heather's tight-lipped smile, the gate agent, Veronica sensed something had been deliberately adjusted before she arrived. Group 1, now boarding. The announcement snapped her back to the present. She tugged lightly at her sleeve and stepped into the priority lane. Ahead of her stood a tall man in a white shirt, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of a teenage boy 16 or 17, wearing a black hoodie and school backpack. But his eyes were unlike most boys his age, not distracted or dreamy, but focused, sharp as though watching the world through a critical lens. He stared at Veronica, not rudely, just observing, like someone who'd seen something adults pretend not to. Veronica looked back, gave a small nod of courtesy. The man whispered, "Leo, don't stare. I know who she is," the boy murmured, not loud, but clear enough for Veronica to hear. "Oh," she asked, with a touch of humor, challenging as ever. "And who do you think I am?" "You're the lady who got pushed out of seat 1A and didn't lose her cool," Leo replied. Without flinching, "I saw it all. I was sitting right across from the counter." Veronica pressed her lips together, not in embarrassment, but because the boy's words rang like confirmation. She hadn't imagined it. Someone had seen. Someone understood. And strangely, that made her feel lighter. Leo's father, firm yet kind, looked at her and nodded an apology. "I'm Kenji. Sorry if he stared too much. It's okay. I'm Veronica." She extended her hand not out of formality, but as a bridge between people standing on the edges of a system. They boarded close together. Veronica turned left, by habit, toward first class, only to be intercepted by Heather's neutral smile. "Ms. Miles, right is your aisle." "Yes, right," she echoed, almost to herself. The right side, the path she'd walked for years, as a young analyst with a laptop, going from economy to meeting rooms and back again. The only difference was, back then, no one knew her name. Now they did, and precisely because they did, they pushed her out. 1 for D was the last row of Economy Plus. I'll seat. Not bad. But the feeling of being pulled from a rightful place under the cover of a technical glitch was not something anyone could quietly accept and still feel whole. Leo sat diagonally across the aisle. As Veronica settled in, he leaned over and whispered, "If I were you, I wouldn't sit here." "But you're not me," she replied, not turning her head. Kenji tapped his son's shoulder enough, but Veronica tilted her head slightly. Added, "And sometimes, adults stay silent not out of fear, but because they're remembering." She opened her laptop, didn't touch the trackpad, just stared at the black screen. Her reflection stared back, face faintly lit, a few wisps of hair across her brow reminding her of herself at 28, on a flight from Dallas to Chicago, after being told by a ticket agent her seat was lost due to check-in delay, though she'd checked in on time, and the person who took it, a white colleague who had arrived late. That time, she stayed quiet, because the company needed that client, because her manager said, "Let's not create a negative impression." But today, she was not that woman anymore. She was the one writing the contracts. She decided the airline's fate. She opened her email, typed the subject, "Urgent Flight 645. Seat reassignment," sent it to Arclight Holdings head of legal Raymond Porter, with a request to audit the full modification history on her booking code. She didn't need permission. No one held that authority anymore. A hush blanketed Economy Plus as the plane began to taxi. No phones, no page turns, only the sound of metal wheels gliding over tarmac, steady, cold, and distancing itself from all the rules they thought would never be questioned. Veronica tilted her head toward the window. Boston shrank behind a veil of silver clouds like a memory gathering dust. But inside her, everything stood sharp. Heather's eyes when she denied her, the man in 1A who refused to move, and Leo's direct words, "I know who she is." A 16-year-old had seen the injustice, yet the system pretended not to. She exhaled not a sigh, but a final emotional clearing before walking into the biggest meeting of the year, a meeting that now was no longer about finance. It was about justice. 9:02 a.m. The 6:45 flight from Boston to New York had just reached cruising altitude. On the small screen hanging in the Economy Plus cabin, a cool green arc stretched across the northeastern U.S., curving over the Hudson River. But in seat 1 for D, Veronica Miles wasn't watching. She wasn't reading, working, or resting. She was waiting for something not from the crew, but from within. A moment of reckoning, a threshold. Jennifer Miller, the lead flight attendant, had just stepped into the cabin, announcing, "We'll begin beverage service shortly. Please keep your seatbelts fastened." But before she could turn, Veronica closed her laptop and rose to her feet. Not hurried, not aggressive, just deliberate, as if every step had been pre-measured. The passengers around her barely registered what was happening. Across the aisle, Leo leaned slightly into the walkway, watching with the wide-eyed attentiveness of someone witnessing something unscripted. Veronica didn't veer left toward the restrooms like any typical passenger might. She walked straightward first class. No one stopped her. No one spoke. But the air seemed to tense, as if the cabin sensed the quiet pressure building within this woman. She reached seat 1A1, occupied by the Yankees cap-wearing man, legs crossed, magazine in hand as if nothing had happened. "Excuse me," she said, voice calm. "This is my seat." He looked up. That same expression that had halted her in her tracks back in 1995. A look of dismissal, disdain, an entitled confidential gaze of men who've always assumed first class belonged to them. "No, this is 1A. I've been here since boarding, and I was reassigned to 1A at the gate. It may be a system error." Then talk to a flight attendant. "I'm not moving." Before he finished, Jennifer Miller arrived. "Is there a problem?" "There's been a seat duplication," Veronica said, eyes still on the man. "I'd like it resolved." Jennifer pulled out her tablet and began checking the seating assignments. Melanie Spencer, another crew member, joined her. They exchanged hushed words. Jennifer's expression subtly shifted. "Ms. Miles, the system shows Mr. Desmond was originally assigned seat 1A. Your upgrade may have been an oversight from the gate team. Unfortunately, there are no remaining first-class seats. I kindly ask that you return to your original seat." Veronica said nothing. Not at first. She didn't move, didn't retreat. She just stood still, steady while dozens of eyes locked on her, every stare a slice. Curiosity, discomfort, avoidance, or worse, dissatisfaction. Then she spoke, softly enough not to raise her voice, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you know who I am?" It wasn't pride. It wasn't a threat. It was a question stripped of pretense, a scalpel cutting directly to the core. "Do you truly understand what you're doing?" Jennifer hesitated. Melanie opened her mouth, but words failed. Veronica lowered her voice further. "I'm not asking for privilege. I didn't demand an upgrade. I'm asking if you realize who the system just accidentally downgraded." A passenger in row 2 leaned slightly forward. The man in 1B shut his laptop. Robert Desmond, the man in 1A, looked up from his golf magazine. Veronica turned to Melanie. "My name is Veronica Miles. I'm the CEO of Arclight Holdings, and in 3 hours, I'll be attending the meeting to finalize the acquisition of SkyVista Airlines." The cabin didn't erupt. There was no applause, no gasp, just stillness, as if the air had been cut from the room. Every person, flight attendant, passenger, even Desmond, frozen by the weight of that revelation. "And this," she held up the ticket with 1A printed clearly, "is the seat I confirmed 3 days ago. The aircraft was swapped, understand. But the fact that every technical issue landed on the one passenger, set to become this company's owner, no longer believe that's a coincidence." Melanie went rigid, eyes dropping to her tablet as if trying to escape the moment. Veronica didn't need a reply. She lowered her hand and said quietly but firmly, "I'll return to economy. But I want the names of today's lead flight attendant and the captain." Jennifer, almost whispering, replied, "I'm Jennifer Miller, lead attendant. Captain David Wilson is flying today." Veronica nodded, turned, and walked away. Each step back through first class left passengers bowing their heads, not because they knew who she was, but because they realized they hadn't asked. Back in 14D, she sat, didn't open her laptop. Leo looked over, admiration and hesitation in his eyes. "You just did something my dad called turning the whole plane around with one question." Veronica didn't smile, but her gaze softened. That question wasn't meant to turn anything. It was meant to remind them, the people they pretend not to see sometimes hold the pen. That writes the final decision. Seat 1 for D became a quiet shell. Veronica sat still, hands laced in her lap, eyes on the window. Outside, white clouds floated by, some heavy like stone, others light like a half-formed memory. Inside, the cabin resumed its rhythm. Murmured conversations, plastic cups clinking, the beep of a beverage cart. but those sounds faded beneath an older Noisione from 1995. She had been 28, newly hired at a top management consulting firm in Chicago. Every week, she flew to Dallas for a client and Airline that, ironically, later became SkyVista's competitor. Back then, she was nobody, a smart black analyst who worked twice as hard, but still gave up elevators when they were full, still got mistaken for an intern in boardrooms. That week, she booked first class her first time in the company's dime, arrived early, checked in properly, but at the gate, she was told her seat was reassigned due to a new policy requiring check-in 90 minutes ahead. A policy no one had ever mentioned. The worst part wasn't the downgrade to 6C. It was watching her white colleague Yameswo arrived after her waltz into first class, hang up his coat, and sip complimentary champagne. She said nothing, not at the gate, not back at the firm, not even when her team lead said, "Let it go, we need this client, you're being too sensitive." Veronica, she was silent, and from that silence, everything began to crumble. 3 months later, she was pulled from the project for team efficiency. 6 months later, passed over for leadership despite leading in revenue. A year later, she left, not bitter, not loud, just withdrawn. Like someone who understood, this place wasn't built for her. But that didn't mean she was giving up. Veronica stared out the window. She wasn't recalling the past that had never left her. It lived in every sit-along glance, every interrupted sentence, every late night under office lights, fixing someone else's presentation. These were memories with no sound but more weight than any words. "You okay?" Leo's voice came like a thread across her thoughts. She turned toward him. Didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. This boy, somehow, understood more than many adults she'd flown beside in first class. "There was a time," she began quietly, "when I stayed silent. And I paid for that silence with a year of injustice no one dared name." Leo leaned back, nodded, said nothing. He knew this wasn't a moment for comedorigist presence. She continued, voice even, unembellished. "But because of that, I learned some silences are complicity. And if you're in a position to change something and stay quiet, then you're helping it stay the same." He pondered this, then asked, "So today, when you stood there, it wasn't out of anger?" Veronica shook her head. "No. I stood there because I know injustice doesn't dissolve on its own. It has to be named. It has to be stared down. It needs someone calm enough not to yell but clear enough not to yield." The boy nodded again. His eyes lit not because he'd heard a lesson, but because he'd seen one. A flight attendant approached, smiling gently, and placed a glass of water before her. Veronica thanked her but didn't touch it. She was listening yet to others, but to herself. Deep within her stirred a familiar yet new feeling, not anger, but awareness. A woman who had once been broken in that very aisle was now back not to settle scores, but to rebuild the structure. The plane sped on through a pale blue sky. Time waited for no one. But Veronica knew the moment she stood in first class and asked one simple question. "Do you know who I am?" That was the pivot. Not just for her, but for a system that had gotten too used to never being questioned. A voice echoed from the intercom. "We'll begin our descent into New York shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Veronica closed her laptop. She had finished the memo to Raymond Porter not to reclaim a seat, but to activate a full-scale audit of SkyVista's operational ethics. No one would hide in shadow anymore. She turned to Leo. "Today, you witnessed something most adults look past." The boy smiled. "And I'll remember it." Veronica smiled too, but in that smile was resolve, spoken, firm. She didn't need applause, didn't need an apology. She needed change, and she would make sure it came. 10:14 a.m. The aircraft touched down at LaGuardia Airport beneath the sharp-edged light of an October morning. The cabin windows mirrored a city sprawling like a mazeeba, familiar and distant. In Economy Plus, passengers bustled to grab their bags, shoulders taut with urgency. But Veronica Miles remained in seat 14D. She didn't rise, didn't queue at the door. She was waiting not for the crew, but for a truth. Her phone buzzed softly in her jacket. On the screen, Raymond Porter, Chief Legal Officer, Arclight Holdings. She brought it to her ear, eyes still fixed on the sun-dappled window. "Raymond, I'm here." His voice was low, measured. "Preliminary investigations and IT just sent over the system logs. The data confirms that at 3:52 a.m., an internal SkyVista account manually locked your seat assignment. The user, Edward Collins, Night Operations Supervisor." Veronica didn't nod, didn't change expression, but her spine straightened like an invisible cord had just tightened along her back. SkyVista's system is designed to auto-protect Platinum Plus passengers during aircraft changes. Raymond continued, each word like a scalpel. "Collins bypassed the option to reassign another passenger. He locked you into economy even while unassigned first-class seats were still available." Veronica was silent. Then, quietly, "So it wasn't a mistake?" "No," Raymond confirmed. "It was deliberate, and more than Faith's posted in internal forums before. Called the merger a financial vulture invasion, and you, by name. The poster child of artificial power, all glossed up with diversity tricks." Another buzzing email arrived. She opened it. An attachment titled Flight to 37_internal override log.pdf, and a screenshot from that same forum. Edward Collins, under his real name, had posted 3 weeks ago, "If that day ever comes, I'd rather pull the seats myself than watch SkyVista become a slave to performative equality slogans." She read the line again, then shut the screen. Her hand gripped the seat edge, not with fury, but with that quiet, taut stillness just before water spills from a brimming glass. "I want every original log backed up, and I want names. Not just who clicked." Edwo stayed silent. Raymond replied, "My team's working with SkyVista's internal investigators. They're in full panic mode. Some will try to cover this up. You need to be prepared." "I've lived through that," Veronica said softly. "But this time no one walks away." She ended the call. At the back of the cabin, Leo and his father Kenji had waited for the crowd to thin before stepping out. Leo looked at Hernet, questioning. "Just watching. You know who did it, don't you?" Leo asked as they entered the jet bridge. Veronica nodded. "A man who thought keeping one seat meant keeping an entire old world." Leo was quiet, then asked suddenly, "Will you forgive him?" She paused. Sunlight spilled through the glass walkway, tracing her face in delicate detail. She didn't turn immediately, only said, "Forgiveness comes after the truth is seen. Right now, the truth must not be minimized." Leo nodded. Kenji gave his son's shoulder a quiet squeeze, recognizing that his boy had just learned something far beyond his years. At the end of the walkway, a man in a deep blue suit held a sign, "Ms. Veronica Miles, Priority Escort." It was Charles Montgomery, Director of Customer Experience at SkyVista. "Ms. Miles, I've been instructed to escort you directly to headquarters. And allow me to extend my deepest apologies," he said. Voice sincere, but his eyes carried the guarded wariness of someone who's seen PR crises explode. Veronica gave a polite nod, then turned to Leo and Kenji. "Thank you both for walking with me this morning. Thank you for not staying silent." Kenji replied, shaking her hand. Leo added, "If you ever need an intern who makes decent coffee, I'm available." Veronica let out a light laugh, then, clear, like a breeze cutting through fog. "I'll remember that, Leo." The car sped toward Manhattan, through the window. The skyline rose like old pillar structures she might soon have to dismantle. Montgomery sat beside her, unable to mask his tension. "I've just been briefed on the early findings," he began, eyes on his phone. "I want you to know that Edward Collins' actions don't reflect SkyVista's values. He's been placed on immediate suspension." Veronica stared ahead, voice even. "If he were alone, he wouldn't have dared, you know that." Montgomery exhaled. "Perhaps we've let the wrong attitudes fester for too long." "Not perhaps," she corrected. "They did, and now it's time to cut them out." She said nothing more. For the rest of the ride, the silence was not awkward, it was the calm before strategy. The focus of someone who hadn't come to own an airline but to rewrite how it sees people. 10:51 a.m. 37th floor Sky Vista headquarters, Manhattan. The glass-walled conference room shimmered like a suspended tank in the sky. Autumn light spilled onto the dark oak flooring, casting silver sheens across the 12-seat table. Everyone was seated already, suits crisp, expressions controlled, as if the events of that morning were merely a footnote in an otherwise routine transaction. But when Veronica Miles entered, a gray folder in hand, the atmosphere shifted. The tremor they'd ignored now arrived like a wave. William Foster, current chairman of Sky Vista, was the first to see a man with meticulously combed silver hair and eyes sharp as scalpel blades. Today, his gaze toward Veronica carried unmistakable caution. Beside him sat CFO Rebecca Martinez and 9 other board members, all of whom had already heard what happened on Flight 237. Ms. Miles, Foster began, with streamlined courtesy, "We deeply regret this morning's incident. On behalf of the board, please accept our sincerest apologies. Rest assured, it will be dealt with." Veronica did not sit. She remained at the head of the table, the light catching the silver trim of her blazer like a blade. She placed the folder down. One beat of silence, and final. "Apologies don't change culture," she said. Her tone was calm, controlled, but every word landed like a stone. "I didn't come here for remorse. I came for action." Foster tilted his head slightly, working to stay composed. "Mr. Collins' conduct is under formal review. But Ms. Miles, this appears to be an isolated no." Veronica cut in. Her gaze pinned him down. "It's not isolated. It's a symptom. A clear expression of a culture that's long dismissed those who don't match the old mold. I'm not talking about individuals. I'm talking about your institution." Rebecca Martinez spoke next, voice cautious. "Then what, specifically, are you proposing?" Veronica opened the folder, revealing a bold title, "Merger Expansion Clause, Cultural and Structural Reform Provisions." She handed a copy to each board member, her movements deliberate, as though placing evidence on the table. "I'm maintaining the $4.3 billion valuation," she said, "but with new binding terms. 1. A full restructure of mid and senior management within 60 days. 2. A third-party cultural audit. 3. A 5-year review of discrimination complaint staff and passengers alike. And 4. A rewrite of all internal training, not just about VIP service, but about how to recognize human dignity." A wave of silence swept the room. Foster furrowed his brow, flipping the first page. "I'm protecting ArcLight Holdings investment," she replied, steady as stone. "We're not buying a broken system. We're investing in a future. And the future won't be built on silence." From the far end, Burton Clay, the eldest board member, spoke. "Ms. Miles, these conditions far exceed the original scope. I don't deny what happened was serious. But restructuring an entire system over one downgraded seat." Veronica turned to him, calm, unflinching. "You don't understand. I'm not reclaiming a first-class seat. I'm reclaiming dignity for everyone who's been quietly pushed out of their rightful place." Without a single voice rising in defense, Rebecca Martinez glanced at Foster, then spoke. Slowly, "She has a point. If today wasn't the first, it certainly won't be the last. And then the cost won't just be this deal, it'll be our future." Foster tensed. He knew the moment Rebecca spoke, the board's center had shifted. He looked back at the documents, then up. "We'll need time to review. You have 45 minutes, Veronica said, placing her watch on the table. "My counsel and I will wait in the adjacent room. When I return, we either sign under these terms or the deal ends here." She turned and walked out, leaving tension like a live wire behind her. The glass door closed. The echo of her momentum remained. In the room next door, Thomas Harrington, her longtime advisor, was waiting. He stood, studying her. "Are you sure you want to push this hard?" Veronica quietly poured a glass of water, took a sip, then looked out the window, where the city spun in its usual dance of profit and power. But today, a woman once pushed from her seat had stepped onto the board and rewritten the rules. 10:37 a.m. The clock placed at the center of the conference table ticked toward the mark. Just 8 minutes left before Veronica Miles would return. In the sun-drenched glass room, the once imposing leather chairs, long symbols of entrenched power, sat heavy as stone. There were no side conversations, no forced smiles, just darting eyes, fingers nervously creasing paper edges, and one question hovering, unspoken: do we truly have the courage to change? William Foster stared at the title printed boldly atop the new clause: Mandatory Organizational Culture Reform Horizon Integration Clause. Each word felt like an incision across the legacy he'd spent a lifetime crafting. He knew that agreeing meant admitting the system he had defended for 3 decades was no longer defensible, and worse, that it had harmed people he had once failed to even see. To his right, Rebecca Martinez underlined key phrases in red, not out of resistance, but to define the threshold she knew they now had to cross. The old scar on her wrist, barely visible beneath her cuff, was a reminder of her own ascent in a workplace where women were trusted only when they stayed silent. She didn't speak, but her glance toward Foster said plainly, "It's time." 2 seats over, Burton Clay still flipped through pages with deliberate care, but the resistance in his demeanor had faded. Just that morning, he'd received a message from his granddaughter, a trainee pilot at Sky Vistao, described how she'd once been mocked for her Latin surname in the crew lounge. After hearing the leaked audio from Edward Collins, she had sent him 2 sentences. "You can't say you love the company if you let it hate people like me." Burton had closed his eyes, and for the first time in his long career, he felt ashamed of his silence. 10:44 a.m. The door opened. Veronica stepped back into the room, not alone. Beside her walked Thomas Harrington, ArcLight Holdings lead counsel, and Camille Davenport, head of strategic communications. None of the 3 spoke. They didn't have to. The air had already shifted. Veronica returned to her spot at the head of the table. Her eyes swept over the faces before her, searching for signs of transformation or resistance. Then, with calm detachment, she asked, "I'm listening." Foster swallowed, not from fear but from the gravity of what he was about to surrender, the version of Sky Vista he had built his identity upon. Following internal discussion, he began, voice steady. "Sky Vista accepts all of ArcLight Holdings' supplemental terms. The amended merger agreement will be signed today." There was no applause, no relief, just a pause, thick and real. Veronica nodded just once, the kind of nod that felt like brushing decades of dust from the air. Thomas laid out the final documents. Rebecca signed first. Then Foster, his hand visibly trembling as he placed ink to paper. When it came to Veronica, she paused, not to reconsider, but to honor the weight of what was dying and what would now be born. After the signatures, Foster didn't leave right away. He stood, straightened his blazer, and faced her. His tone was no longer superior, no longer defensive, only honest. "Ms. Miles," he said quietly, "I don't know if I'll remain through this restructuring, but I do know you may have just saved this company from the worst fate of all, being forgotten." Veronica was silent. Then, offering the dignity of a parting truth, she replied, "No organization is forgotten for doing right, only for refusing to see." Foster nodded, turned, and walked out. The glass door closed behind him, sealing a chapter now finished. That very afternoon, Sky Vista issued an official press release confirming the successful merger with ArcLight Holdings and announcing the launch of its historic reform campaign, Project Horizon, Reclaiming Dignity. Among the immediate actions, the termination of Edward Collins and for senior managers, identified as enablers or silent collaborators. Additionally, for the first time in aviation history, a cultural oversight council would include young employees and passengers with lived experience. Veronica left the headquarters at 4:15 p.m. The Manhattan sky wasn't clear, it was gray and still. But for her, this wasn't a day of victory. It was a day of necessity. In the car, she reopened an old message from Leo. "If someday you need someone to remind you why you started, I'll text you. She closed her eyes, leaning against the glass. The city receded. But one question remained. If justice begins by reclaiming a single seat, where does it end? 3 weeks later, the sky above JFK International glowed with a soft, silvery light. On runway 3, rarely used for ceremony, a crowd gathered. Press, airline employees, union reps, and high school students invited to witness a milestone. Today marked the official debut of Project Horizon, Reclaiming Dignity, the largest cultural reform in SkyVista's history, now operating under its new name, Horizon Atlantic Airways. Veronica Miles stepped out of a black SUV. She wore a charcoal overcoat, no badges, no insignia. Only her walk spoke power, calm, steady, measured by purpose. The stage was minimalist, a gray-silver backdrop, the new logo, and the phrase, "Seats don't define space. Values do," in the front rows, at those who had once stood on the opposite side of reform. No quiet. Reflective, Rebecca Martinez, newly appointed coup, nodded respectfully as Veronica passed. There was no need for more words. They had endured a long season of friction. Now came the chapter for action. 9:30 a.m. The event began with a short documentary. No narration. No dramatic score. Just raw footage. Passengers denied boarding. Employees reprimanded for speaking up. Complaint letters buried in inboxes. And finally, Veronica herself, her downgrade, her confrontation, her signature. The film ended in silence. No transition music. No MC. Only the wind gently brushing the microphones. Then, Veronica stepped forward. No speech in hand. No teleprompter. Just her voice, steady, quiet, unmistakable. Sometimes we think we're standing up for a seat. But really, we're standing for every person who's ever been pushed out, not just from a seat, but from their own sense of dignity. She paused. No applause. Just listening. And that's all she needed. Today, she continued, we're not just launching a campaign. We're making a promise that every decision in this airline will be weighed not by nameplates or skin tones, but by fairness. She raised her hand. A massive screen lit up behind her. The first image, the airline's new seat model, sleek, inclusive, and on the back, a small etched line, seen, heard, valued. She turned, invited the next speaker, Simeon, unexpected, Mason Chen, the 16-year-old who had witnessed her being denied her seat that fateful morning. Mason wore a modest suit, his gaze still soft but clear. Veronica introduced him. He told me once that sometimes the most necessary thing is for adults to finally see what children have seen all along. Today, he represents the generation that will inherit the skies we leave behind. Mason didn't give a speech. He walked up, placed a small seat model on the podium, and turned to the crowd. I don't know how to say things the way grown-ups do, but I do know if one day my child is ever pushed out of a seat like Ms. Miles was, at least I can say, I once did something, even small, to change that. A pause, then applause, not for eloquence, but for truth. News outlets ran headlines by nightfall. A new airline, born from the right moment. But in her ride back to the office, Veronica didn't read them. She opened a handwritten letter sent by Jared Knox, a former employee once reprimanded for defending a black passenger at check-in back in 2019. The handwriting was slanted, but firm. I don't work at SkyVista anymore. But today, when I saw your image in the news, I cried. Because someone finally proved that kindness doesn't have to cost your courage. Thank you for doing what I never had the strength to. She folded the letter, looked out the window. Planes taxied, lifted, cut across sky, and behind every seat, there was a story, a name, a reminder. Silence should never be the cost of flight.